When we listen to rock or pop music, we know we can expect some combination of chorus and verse. And with jazz, we usually hear a melody followed by virtuosic improvisations over the same set of chord changes that the melody used. But what about this kind of music? Plenty has been said about Boards of Canada's appeals to nostalgia, their obscure samples, and their overall vibe. But for a long time, I've been wanting to do a deeper dive on how they actually structure their songs and their albums. And it turned out that spectrograms were a much more useful tool for this than manuscript paper. The year is 1998. Scottish electronic music duo Boards of Canada has just released their debut LP, Music Has the Right to Children, to critical acclaim. Brothers Michael Sanderson and Marcus Owen started creating music together 17 years prior, and had developed a well-tuned sensibility for creating music that combined easygoing hip-hop grooves, psychedelia, warm organic synth textures, and a deep-rooted headiness full of arcane references to geometry, numerology, mysticism, and more. From extremely quiet samples pitch-shifted and reversed into obscurity, to percussion generated entirely from chopped up and manipulated vocal samples of loved ones. Michael and Marcus would sonically bridge the gap between the music of the 70s and the lo-fi aspirations of the future, in a masterpiece that would go on to become commonly regarded as one of the most indispensable electronic music recordings of all time. I've personally been a huge Boards of Canada fan since about 2013, when Tomorrow's Harvest was released. Where is my copy? Here it is. I recently had the opportunity to go to Calgary for a friend's wedding, and I found out that I was going to be very close to the site where this photo was taken. So I went to visit the Mount Norquay Outlook. I listened to a lot of Boards of Canada on that trip, including their EP Trans-Canada Highway while I was driving on the Trans-Canada Highway. So very nerdy Boards of Canada pilgrimage happened. There is sort of a whole internet community based around trying to figure out where they got their samples from and what they're trying to sort of say with all the subliminals in their music. But what there isn't so much of is how do they actually structure their tracks? What are the arrangements? So here's a graphic I made. This represents the length of all the tracks on the album. And as you can see, there's kind of a pattern to it with short, long. And that pattern sort of changes more toward the end of the album. All of the tracks that are in blue are under 2 minutes. A vignette is a brief, evocative description, account, or episode. This is really the perfect way to describe the shorter tracks on this album. They serve as preludes, palette cleansers, interludes, while still having their own identities and never sounding like filler. Music theory, as it is taught in academia, would basically describe the first track, Wildlife Analysis, as an ambiguous E minor pentatonic texture over a pedal point. But it would really be discounting Boards of Canada's entire approach to music to oversimplify it that much. There's so much rhythmic and melodic and textural information happening here that isn't so easy to put on paper, so instead of looking at notes on a staff, I actually want to look at a spectrogram. It's kind of like a three-dimensional waveform. The regular type of waveform that you see music represented with online a lot, it only shows how loud things are over time. This doesn't tell you what the thing sounds like at all. Whereas a spectrogram gives a much more complete picture because we're getting information about high and low sounds, where they fall in the spectrum, in addition to volume. So these vertical lines represent short sounds that take up a lot of the audio spectrum, with a kick being down here. A snare is kind of everywhere else from the middle up, and a hi-hat more just in the upper region. Melodies are recognizable as horizontal imprints. Some of the coolest things about this are comparing different tracks at a glance, seeing visual representations of vibrato and delay, and noticing overall trends, like the lack of higher-pitched sounds on tracks like Kaini Industries and Bokuma versus the filter sweeps on triangles and rhombuses. What is a filter sweep? It's where you stop some of the high-frequency sounds and then let them come in and out. And that's what we're seeing on this spectrogram. Let's listen for a sec. And so that's what gives this track its kind of cycle rhythm, and we can see it also gets louder toward the middle and then gets quiet again, fades out, and then what comes at the end? just this wonderful, unrelated, 20-second long little melodic thing that happens. And we can tell it's just a melody with a lot of harmonics going up and some delay happening. It's very detuned. The lines are very wiggly. Wiggly lines is a great way to describe Boards of Canada synthesizer sounds. So we could write that part down on manuscript paper, but I think right now, talking about overall track structure, that's kind of all we need to see, is that this track is this thing, in and out, and then this melodic thing. And it's really cool to have it arranged this way. So Color of the Fire is kind of one of the more psychedelic, more subliminal sounds and voices, kind of really stretched and manipulated, and we don't even need to hear it to see that happening. I mean, look at these, the shapes of these lines. I'm going to zoom in on one. Pitch going up, down, and then there's a delay effect, echo. So that's what that kind of thing looks like on a spectrogram. Looking at the whole piece again, this one, it's another short track. It's just under 2 minutes, and it's these manipulated samples with some synthesizers. You can see that the texture gets a lot busier right here. So what happens? That's where the bass pad comes in. So if we look at that, just listen to that section by itself. Yeah, that's where our bass pad comes in. What are these wiggly lines? What are these wiggly lines? This is glassy, abrasive kind of synthesizer that fades out. When we look at the longer, kind of a more beat-driven tracks, we can tell a lot about the density of what's happening, where you see a lot more of these lines in this part of the track. Around here. So let's just play it. There's a lot of stuff with these chopped vocal sounds going on, and then over here, less percussion and less of the small vocal fragments, plus the synth melody that is kind of moving around in the medium high, we could call it, register up here. All that stuff. So in this program I can do kind of a filter sweep. We're getting medium down into the low pitches. Just high frequencies. And then back to everything. So we see more comes in here. There's a little break here. No kick. So they don't do stuff on an 8 or 16 bar cycle like a lot of music in this genre is done. It's unpredictable, and there's tons of different layers of sound happening. And what happens at the end? Percussion stops, obviously, the lines go away. And we have this filter sweep up and down, just like track 5. Right, very cool. Pete Standing Alone is one of the more segmented tracks. We can see that there's a lot of parts where the drums drop out. We can see that there are several different densities within the percussion heavy part. See this part where it's a lot less dense. So, and it's, again, it's irregular. It's not a loop. So what happens? We have some synth chords. percussion. Back to the first texture, but now with some birds, some more nature samples. Then we go back to that texture, but a little more dense. The word orange is very important on this album, so I'm glad that the default isotope color tracks. Not as squiggly as some of the others, but there's some detuning in there. Lastly, I want to take a look at Happy Cycling, the last piece on the track. It's the longest, almost 8 minutes long, and we can see that we start with drums and a slow build. Pads come in here. This is from a choral piece. There's a lot of information online about what they sampled. Then some, I'm gonna guess, lead synths come in. Eventually you start to know what different types of sounds look like. And something happens here. It's a very specific bird call. So what's happening here now? Versus the first time we heard it. They only played it once, and then every other time after that, they had that guy on a loop for half of the cycle. And it resolves. Nice. Then something gets a little thicker in the bass down here. Bass synth. Sub comes in. Then everything changes right here. Oh yeah. So this is one of the nicest arrival points. This is like, if you've ever seen one of these nature documentaries where it's a time lapse of a plant growing and a flower blooming, this track is constructed like that. And this is the flower blooming. That's how I think of it. And they like to sample nature documentaries, so this way of looking at their music, I think it's fair. Then what happens at the end? Immediately, we just filtered out all these high frequencies. Drums have stopped, so now we're just getting subliminal vocal textures. And this melody on it. Then everything else goes away. And the album ends on that wonderful little melody. Anyway, I hope you learned something interesting from this. Spectrograms are pretty easy to make with inexpensive or free software. I used the Elements version of Izotope RX. I think I got the whole bundle for less than $20. And it can be a really neat way to see at a glance what is happening with a piece of music. If you're new here, I like to talk about saxophone, music theory, and pretty much anything music related. So if that interests you, consider hitting that button.